So, some introductory, preliminary stuff. I'm going to tell you some things that aren't true tonight, for the sake of simplicity. But if you pretend that they're true, you won't get you won't go off. You get misled. I also don't want people feeling bad about not knowing things, or embarrassed that they don't know something. Because if you don't know something, or you don't understand something, and you keep moving on, you're not going to understand the rest of it, and then it'll be kind of pointless for you to be here. And I'm also going to show you some pictures that aren't very good, necessarily, but good at showing, hopefully, the point I want to make. Does that sound okay to everyone? Mm-hmm. So don't make fun of me either. That's part of this.
I have him on one that I took, but he's demonstrating bad examples.
All right. So, also, if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them, and we'll do it. So, assumptions, welcome. Oh, tonight we're going to focus mostly on a little bit of theory, and also then the technical aspects of the camera, what the buttons do, and how to make them do things. And next week, we're going to do more of how to apply that to make a better picture. So, like for instance, we're going to learn how to shoot in aperture priority mode, and next week we'll learn why you might do that, rather than something else. So it's going to be a little bit technical tonight, and not as good, and next week hopefully we'll get to look at some better pictures and a little more relaxed. So, assumptions for tonight: you have a DSLR. You mostly or always shoot in auto mode, or one of the scene modes, like the one with the flower, or the sports mode, or night, or the one with the mountain in it. You don't know what all your camera buttons and knobs do, and it's safe to say I made a true assumption on that. And then you want to improve your photos, and that's evident by the fact that you're here. So I think a lot of people have a misconception of what photography is, or what the goal of photography should be. They think that a photograph should replicate a scene in an accurate way. It should be an accurate reflection of reality. But that's not actually possible to do that. It's not possible to represent a three-dimensional scene in 2 dimensions on a screen or on a piece of paper. So if that's your goal, you will never succeed at it. So don't try. That's a fool's errand to do that. And that's not even really the point. As the light comes through the lens changes it and makes it focus on a certain spot. So even before the light hits the sensor, you've already failed at that, if that's what you're trying to do. So don't try to do that, because you'll never succeed. And that's not really the point anyways. The point is to, rather than replicate the accuracy of the physical things in the scene, is to replicate the feelings and emotions that the scene induced in yourself. So, as an example of this is a waterfall we saw at our honeymoon, and I took the picture, and when we were there it was huge and imposing and loud, and like the spray comes off and it's cool on your face, and there's a loud noise, and we were like looking up at it like this and really close. So I took a picture, and none of that is in this picture. There's nothing, there's no noise, there's no cool mist, there's no imposing size. It's not a very good picture at all. It doesn't replicate reality. It's impossible to do that. But this one here also doesn't really replicate reality. Is that what life looks like? Anyone seen that before? No, that's not what life is like. This is another one. It was like a cool evening in the summer. The temperature's like just the right temperature, and it was quiet and peaceful and still. And so I think this shows the peace and the stillness of the evening, but it doesn't show how it really was. It really wasn't like that. Like those lights, they don't make those stars. That's just something that's only in photos. And the reflections on the car, they aren't that clear really in reality, because there's like dust on the car and stuff. And you don't also see all the stuff around, like the garbage can that was right here, or the garbage bag that was on the other side, or the bum that was just on the other side of the car. So this is not an accurate depiction of reality, but what it is an accurate depiction of the way I felt when I was there. This is another one. That's my son. He doesn't really look like that. The universe isn't in black and white, and his head is not that big relative to the rest of his body, and his eyes aren't that big. But when I look at this picture, I feel towards him as I felt when I took the picture. And maybe you can kind of see how that works. Here's another one. This was our Christmas card this year. This is not what it looks like 2 weeks before Christmas in a house with 2-year-old. Okay? There's stuff all over the floor, and it was like, he's running around the house. I had to put chocolate chips in the tree there to get him to pick at it. And so it made this, and this represents how I feel about Christmas and about him, and kind of the wonder and awe he must feel about Christmas tree and all lights and stuff. So I think it's successful at replicating the feelings of the scene and the emotion of the scene, and doesn't really care whether it replicates accurately the reality of the scene. So if you understand that and apply that, and rather than think how am I going to capture the scene, think how am I going to capture the emotion of the scene, you made one step in the right direction already. So here's some of the most famous photographs. This is good, not because of anything in the scene. It's actually not that great a picture. It's kind of poorly composed and poorly exposed. But we can immediately feel how it must have felt to be standing where the photographer was when he took the picture. And you can feel the energy and the excitement and the thrill of that. There's another one. Again, not that great a picture, kind of black and white, low quality, but you can feel immediately the feelings of what that would have felt like. There's another one. This is a really famous one, and I think it's famous because it also immediately induces a feeling. This is the same picture, or not the same, it's a picture of the same event from a different position. There's the man there, the guy that ended up standing in front of the tanks right there. He's standing right there, and there come the tanks on the other side. But this picture never became an icon. It's not at all that great a picture because it fails. It accurately reproduces reality. There really was a bulldozer there. These guys really were running, but it doesn't recreate the emotion of the scene in the way that this one does. Does that make sense? So if this one was the one that was released when it happened, it would have been totally different. But luckily there was that one. Is that clear? Everyone understand that? And this picture here accurately represents maybe reality. That's probably what it was actually like to be there, or something similar to it. Close enough to it. And then this photo here was taken with a very similar camera at almost the same moment by someone who knew how to use their camera and understood that it's not about representing reality, but rather the emotion that you feel experiencing the reality. So you see there's a big difference between these two pictures, this one and this one. And this one's the better picture. So tonight I hope that we can learn how to go from that there to this one here by controlling the camera better and focusing on not capturing the reality, but capturing the emotion of the scene. So we're going to start from the start. So everyone, let's take out their cameras. People often hold their camera incorrectly, and they grip the lens in like a C grip, like that, like C with their hands. It's not the right way to do it. That's the wrong way to do it. So I don't want that to happen. Oh, I forgot one. I guess we'll go afterwards. So grip like she is underneath the lens, and you want your left hand to be under there and supporting the weight of the camera. So your right hand should be kind of free and not supporting any of the weight of the camera. Make sense, everyone? And she can operate the zoom on her lens there with that hand, or any buttons that are on that side of the camera with her thumb. So there's probably one or two buttons on the left side of your camera. And then the other hand is free to operate the controls on the other side, and then the shutter. The reason you don't want to have the weight in your right hand, which is really, that's how you would normally do it when you pick up the camera. It's kind of the instinctive way is to keep the weight in your right hand. But if the weight's there in your right hand when you're pressing the shutter, it's more likely that you'll shake the camera and get some blur. So if you keep the weight in your left hand and then use your right hand only for pressing the shutter and some of the other controls, you'll get a much clearer picture generally. The other reason you want to hold it underneath and not like with the C is because when you hold it with the C, that naturally just kicks your elbow out like that. And when you hold it underneath, it naturally brings your elbow in, and that's a lot more stable position. And you're a lot less likely to get the camera shake and a blurry photo as a result if you keep your hand and both your elbows in like that. Everyone understand? Going back to this one, you can't take a picture like this when you shoot on auto mode. Because auto is a general purpose compromise. The camera doesn't know anything about emotion. All it knows is what's the nature of the scene, how much light is there. So this was shot on auto. The camera doesn't know what the subject is. It doesn't know what you want to capture. It doesn't know what you feel. It doesn't know anything about emotion. And also it doesn't have a brain, so that kind of puts it at a handicap. So if you're letting the camera dictate to you what a picture should look like, you're probably not going to end up something like this, because you have a lot better capability to interpret reality than the camera does. Another reason to stop shooting auto is that you can take a lot more satisfaction and credit for your photos, rather than just being the person who's standing back there and pressing the little button on the top that makes a clicky noise. You can have a feeling that you took control over your tool, the camera, and really made it work to its greatest potential to fulfill what you wanted it to do. Okay, so pretty clear on this. One more thing, people like to close one eye and stick the other eye in the viewfinder, but it's better normally to keep two eyes open, because when you're looking through the lens, there's a lot that's going on that you can't see, especially when you're taking pictures of living things or moving things. There'll be something moving maybe into the picture from one side, and if you only have one eye open into the lens, you are not going to see that coming in, like if you have kids or something. But if you have the other eye open, then you're a lot more likely to, you have a lot better awareness of what's going around or what's going on around the camera. If you find that too difficult to do, try switching eyes, because with one of my eyes I just can't do it, and with the other eye it's completely natural and completely easy. And when I was first trying to do it with both eyes, I was using the wrong eye, I just couldn't get it. And then the very first time I tried it with the other eye, it was just like really easy, no big deal. So you can find that you'll probably have one eye that you prefer to use. So do that, keep both eyes open if you can. In order to make
I was like, I think I have that same picture.
a photograph, you have to let a certain amount of light in through the lens to hit the sensor in the back of the camera. And the sensor is in place of film in these digital cameras. There used to be an open film back there, and light would come streaming in and mark it. But now there's just a sensor and the light comes in. Making a properly exposed photograph like this one is analogous to filling a bucket of water, where a totally full bucket that's properly exposed. If you don't fill it all the way, it's what they call underexposed. That means not enough light came in through the lens to hit the sensor, and it's going to be too dark. If you overflow the bucket, that means too much light was let in, and it's going to be too bright in photograph. Do you see how that's a natural, intuitive thing, that if there's too much light in the picture, it's going to be too bright, because light makes things bright, and if there's not enough light, it's going to be dark. Okay. The water, of course, in the bucket analogy represents the light in the camera. So this is an underexposed photograph. Not enough light came through the lens to hit the sensor. This is overexposed. And this is simulated, actually. This is the photograph I actually took, and I just changed it in the computer to simulate what it would be like. So this is overexposed, it's too bright. And this is the three together. The overexposure and underexposure of a camera is measured in what they call exposure values, or stops. And a full stop, a single stop, represents a doubling or a cutting in half of the amount of light that hits the sensor. So, properly exposed photo on the left, or in the middle, if you cut the amount of light in half that hits the sensor, you're going to get a photo. Actually, this is minus 2 stops. So if you cut it in half again, you get an underexposed photo like the one on the right. But if you double the amount of light that hits the sensor, and then double it again, you get this one on the left. So, is that clear? How we can use the term stops? Like, increase your exposure by a stop, or I'm 2 stops under. Does that kind of understand how that would work? Or you can say exposure value. It's another, I think that's, exposure value is the technical term, stops is the lingo. So photos that's overexposed by 1 stop means twice as much light hit the sensor as was necessary to make the proper exposure, or twice as much water went into the bucket and it overflowed. Does that make sense? Or if it's underexposed, it's like half, filling the bucket halfway. So this is kind of a scale. These are 1 stop increments. So you start from here and double the amount of light, you get to the -2, double it again, -1, double it again, you get to the correct exposure, double it again, and so on. Pretty soon you're overexposed. Since this is kind of logarithmic and not linear, each doubling is multiplying. So 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, makes sense? So the amount of light in that photo on the end is not 6 times as much as this one on the on this end. It's something like 128 times as much, or something like that. 64 maybe. I don't know. Does that make sense? So you can really accommodate a wide variety of conditions using exposure values. There are 3 elements which work together to create the proper exposure in your camera. Shutter speed, aperture, and what's called ISO. Shutter speed is pretty straightforward. Aperture and ISO, we're going to really get into a little more detail. The shutter speed in our water analogy is like the length of time that the faucet is on. So the longer you have the faucet filling the bucket, the more water you're going to get in the bucket. So I made a little graph on the side of this chart thing here, where these values at the bottom are going to let in more light, brighter light. And the values at the top are going to let in less light. Does that make sense? Do you see that here? So this scale of shutter speed values is kind of the standard scale, and each step is 1 stop. So 1/1000th of a second is half as long as 1/500th of a second. You see how going from 1/1000th to 1/500th is going to double the amount of light that enters the camera. And you can see down here it's not quite exact, like 1/15th is not twice 1/8, but it's close enough that it doesn't really matter. Let's see here. The speed of the shutter is measured in fractions of a second normally, or seconds sometimes. And it represents the amount of time that the shutter is open, exposing the sensor to light. And this is the standard scale. I also made one on your notes here, and that represents a range of 10 stops, the one in your notes. There's 11 values for a total distance between them 10 stops. Make sense? And before we get to aperture, you see in your camera, if you look at your camera, let's see if I can find one here. Nope, I'm not going to find it. Let's not do that yet. Don't look at it. The smaller the numbers, like 8 is smaller than 15, but it actually represents a larger amount of light getting into the sensor because it's a fraction. It's a denominator and a fraction. Everyone familiar with that concept?
A piece of pie.
Yes. This is going to come in when we talk about aperture, which we're going to talk about now. The aperture is the size of the hole in the lens through which light passes. And I happen to have a lens here with an aperture that you can really see easily. So I'm going to pass around, and the way you can change the aperture is hold the main part of the lens right here, which says night core and like the main body of the lens. And there's this little ring at the back, and you can turn it to see the aperture change. So I'll start here and just try not to touch the front of it. You'll be able to see as it goes around, there's a hole in the lens where light's coming through, and it increases and decreases in size. So a smaller aperture, smaller hole, is represented by a larger f number. Because like shutter speed, that's also a fraction. So the number that you see is the denominator of the fraction.
Wait, say that again. So
A larger hole in the lens, a larger sized aperture, is represented by a smaller number. Because you see that's f over 2, and f over 2 is a larger number than f over 4. Just like 1 over 8 is a larger number than, say, 1 over 125. Even though the number there, 125, is larger than 8, it's kind of backwards. So that can trip a lot of people up at first, but once you spend an hour thinking about it, then it kind of goes away. And keep in mind, those are fractions. The f represents the focal length of the lens. So the aperture is a ratio of the focal length to the size of the hole in the lens. No. So, what else am I going to say about that? You see the range there? The smallest hole, it's real small. Like you could fit the pin or the head of a pin through there, but not much else. And then the largest one, the whole lens is open up to the light. So each of these values represents a full stop. The smallest one you saw was, I think, f22. Yep. And the largest one was a little bit larger than f2. So the aperture value is most commonly called the f number or f stop. C stop, the wording is exposure values, huh? Mm-hmm. And I also printed a little scale of the standard in 1 stop increments apertures. And if you look on this lens here, I'll pass it around again, you'll see these numbers, because these are kind of the standard full stop increments, so they're the ones identical to what's on here and what's on your sheet. A lens that opens wide, has a wide aperture like f2 or f2.8, it's called a fast lens, because you see how having a bigger aperture will allow you to use a faster shutter speed. If you have a given shutter speed and given aperture, opening the aperture and speeding the shutter up, closing down the time the shutter's open, you can get the same amount of light in. The aperture is equivalent to the size of the faucet. So a larger faucet that's turned on for a little less time will give you the same amount of water as a smaller faucet that's turned on for a longer time. Does that make sense to everybody? So using shutter speed and aperture, we can start to see how you can control your exposure and get different exposures based on whatever it is you want. So ISO, you'll mostly be adjusting your shutter speed and your aperture when you take photos, and ISO is kind of a last resort, and it represents the sensitivity of the sensor to light. And in our bucket analogy, that's like the size of the bucket. So a smaller bucket will take less water to fill properly. A higher ISO will take less light to properly expose photograph. So I've done the same thing with there as I have with the other ones. These values at the bottom are more sensitive to light, ISO 6400, and ISO 100 is a lot less sensitive to light. So all else being equal, if you shoot two pictures, one at ISO 100 and the other at ISO 6400, one at ISO 6400 is going to be a lot brighter because the sensor is a lot more sensitive to light at that ISO. Does that make sense? So I put the standard ISO scale here, and each of those values represents a doubling in the amount of sensitivity to light, or if you're going the other way, cutting in half of the sensitivity of the sensor to light. And the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's a 7-stop ISO scale there, and that's the same one that's in your notes. So that represents a range of 7 stops. And also, the ISO can help you see the difference in the amount of light that you can accommodate. So ISO 100 is the least sensitive, and then you double it to 200, and double it again. That's only 2 stops, but you see you're already 4 times greater than the ISO. And the same as with exposure values or stops, that when you move 1 stop and then again, you didn't move equivalent to 2. It's gonna be on video. you double it every time. You double the amount of light that comes in every time you increase the exposure value by 1. So by the end, even though we only move 7 stops, we go from 100 to 1200, or excuse me, 12,800, and that's quite a range. Okay? So these are some common aperture values illustrated relative to each other, and you can see even only at f11. That's only like 2/3 of the way up, how small the aperture is compared to f2, which is at the bottom of the scale again. And that's kind of reflects what you saw in the lens that I passed around. So these 3, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture together, create what is commonly called the exposure triangle. They're the 3 elements that you would adjust to make an exposure. See EV in the middle? Your exposure value is based on shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Does everyone understand that?
That's good language.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so why would you choose one value over another value? Actually, before we do that, to make sure we're understanding this concept, let's just say I shot a photo using these values that are highlighted. And then I wanted to take another photo of the same thing, but instead of using ISO 200, I wanted to use ISO 100. To make an equivalent exposure, what would I have to change? Other than the ISO, and how would I have to change it? Any guesses? There's more than one right answer.
You're either going to adjust your shutter speed or your aperture.
What, if I was going to adjust my aperture, what value would I use?
Your aperture, you would stop, well, to probably 5.6 if you're gonna bump it up to 100, you're gonna want to let in more light, your aperture.
Okay. So if you move one direction on the scale in one of the values, you have to move an equivalent amount in the opposite direction on one of the other values to get an equivalent exposure. Okay. Or else, you remember when I showed you the picture at the tower, where it was too bright and then properly exposed and then too dark? If you just move one of these in one direction, it's going to change the brightness or the exposure value of the photo. So to get two identical exposures using different values, you have to adjust equally in opposite directions. Make sense? So if I was going to say, let's use 1/30th of a second exposure instead of 1/250th, can someone give me some values for aperture and ISO that I would use to get an equivalent exposure? Anyone? Is this making sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I go,
You going
One, two,
1/30th?
yep,
With 3, so you just move other.
so can you
So
give me some
F6,
values?
can we do F16 or F22? And can you do both?
You can do both.
So F16 and 100.
Okay. So if you see, if we increase our exposure value by 3 stops, going 1, 2, 3, then we have to move the other parameters in the opposite direction 3 stops. It doesn't have to be 1. The aperture doesn't have to be f22. The aperture could be, or the aperture could be f20. We could even move ISO and shutter speed down and then kick the aperture up. You see? So they're all kind of independent, and you can adjust all 3 to make the correct exposure. Is that pretty clear? Does everyone understand that? Any questions about that specifically? Okay, so we're going to run, even to make this even more clear, we're going to run over this. Here's a nice picture. These are the values I shot it at. So assuming I wanted to use those values in blue, 1/125th of a second instead of 1/30th of a second, and ISO 100 instead of 400, what does my aperture value have to be to get an equivalent exposure to that?
5.6. 4?
Uh,
2.
No.
anyone? You tell me why?
Are you keeping it? I don't think you have to move the aperture at all. Is that right?
So if that's what I shoot at, and then I want to use the values highlighted in blue there.
Oh, wait.
So if you're moving each column by 2, wouldn't you drop the aperture by 4?
Yes,
I think
because
so.
2 plus 2. We're decreasing the exposure value by 2 by changing the shutter speed, making it darker by 2 stops. And then same thing again with ISO, for a total of 4 stops. So then we have to change the aperture to f4, increase the exposure value for the f number on the aperture by 4 stops. Here's a nice picture. There's my values that I shot it with. So if I wanted to use 1/60th of a second instead, what values should I use to get an equivalent exposure? Could I change the ISO? Would that help? Or would that make the problem worse?
Aperture, let's go up.
2.
5.6.
Yeah. So I think we're getting the hang of this. There it is, 5.6. So here's one more. I think this might be the last one. So here's my values. And then if I want to shoot at ISO 100 instead of 800, any suggestions for settings? There's more than one right answer.
Shutter speed down to 115.
Okay, could do that. Or maybe another one. Another alternative. That's not wrong, that's right. But you know, there's
130th.
What'd she say? I didn't hear her.
She said if you move your shutter speed to 1/15th of a second, increase the exposure value on your shutter speed by 3 stops. That
Oh.
compensates for decreasing it by 3 in the ISO. So, someone was going to give me another alternative.
Change your shutter speed to 1/60th, and then move your aperture to 2.
Yes. So they work independently of each other. So if you and me and Nate all shot this picture using the values we just said, then we would all have a similar, exactly the same exposed photograph. Sense? So that was my suggestion. I think that's. I knew that was gonna happen. I knew someone was gonna say it, and then they're going, "Oh no, I did it right. You all did it wrong." Okay.
Great minds.
So why would we choose to adjust shutter speed or aperture or ISO over one another? Why would we prefer to change one or the other? They each have different effects on the quality of the photo. Not the quality necessarily, but the way it turns out. So shutter speed. Many people think of a photo as representing a point in time, but it doesn't actually represent a point in time. What it is a record of everything that happens in the frame over a period of time. Usually it's a short period, like 1/50th of a second. It's a real tiny period. but it's not point in time, it's the length of time. So when you increase your shutter speed, more can happen in a longer period of time, right? So if you have a pinwheel here that's spinning and you have a 1/1000th of a second shutter speed, how far is it going to spin in only 1/1000th of a second? It's hardly going to move at all. So if that value, or if this photo on the end was shot 1/1000th, that could be a spinning pinwheel, and that's what we would get from it. And then if you use longer shutter speed, more can happen in that time, and your camera's going to record everything that happens, but as long as the shutter's open. So use a longer one to get that window, and then even a longer one to get the one on the right. Make sense? One of the dangers here is your hands don't hold still. They're always kind of moving and shaking and stuff. And so any movements in your hands are going to get transferred to the camera. So if you use too long of a shutter speed, your hands are going to move like that, and then you're not just going to get a blurry wheel with the stick clear, your entire picture is going to be blurry. Because it's as if the whole world is moving through the eyes of the camera. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the rules of thumb is to keep your shutter speed at least, this is hard to explain, at least as fast as the focal length you're using in your lens. So, do you know the focal length of your lens there? Should say like 18 to 55.
Yeah,
or
it's
something.
18 to 55.
So it zooms out and in. So if you're at 18, you want to use a shutter speed 1/18th of a second or faster. Does that make sense? Or if you're at 55 millimeters, what shutter speed should you use or faster? What's the minimum shutter speed? Okay. Oh, and by the way, these values here on this little chart, most cameras will do values in between these ones that I showed. So you could have an aperture of like f4.5, and even though it's not on this chart, your camera can still do it, or an ISO of 150. So you're not just limited to these numbers, but these represent the full stops. You can use a tripod, like I have on that video camera there, to increase your shutter speed to even several seconds. I think here's an example. There's a 1/20th of a second there, and the Ferris wheel, you see how it moved a little bit in that time? You can see the movement, especially out here. But if you have it open for 4/1 seconds, or 4 seconds, that's a lot longer than you can possibly handhold the photo, or handhold the camera, because you'd have to have, there's a negative focal length, so that's impossible. But if you shoot on a tripod, the photo's actually still sharp. You see the brace thing here? It's not blurry, so it's sharp. Only things that move are gonna show the movement. So longer shutter speed, you need to use a tripod. Or you can do something like just put your camera on a flat surface, and then use the self-timer and press it, and then don't touch it. Let it wait 5 seconds, whatever, and then take the picture. Or somehow brace the camera so it's not shaking from your hand. So here's a photo. I use a very fast shutter speed, and you can see that the water looks like it's just hanging in the air, and that's like a spray park, so the water's flying everywhere. But if you cut the shutter speed down to just a tiny fraction of time, not much is going to happen in that time, and so the water just kind of drops hanging in the air, and his feet aren't on the ground, so the shutter speed is fast enough that he caught him completely off. And even though he was running, it was such a fast shutter speed that it looked so sharp because he hardly moved at all in that time. Here's an example of a longer shutter speed. I think I used a 30-second shutter speed on this one with the tripod. And the fountain there, you can see the combined effect of the water spraying for 30 seconds produces that kind of ghostly cloud look. And then here the car lights. You see how a car traveled from all the way over there, all the way to here in that time. And everything that happened was recorded on the sensor. Does that make sense? Do we see now why some photos have weird light trails like this in them? Because of the long shutter speeds. So that would have been impossible with hand holding it. You have to use a tripod or some kind of stabilization. So this might look like the back of your camera. I want everyone to look at the back of the cameras in a second here. What's the shutter speed displayed on this camera here? Can anyone tell from?
1,000.
Okay. So everyone, let's see. Can you identify the shutter speed on the back of your camera? You might have to open the lens caps too, for your camera to give you a suggested value. Otherwise, it's not going to get you light in there.
There's also maybe go on the top of your camera,
Yes.
depending on the model. And LCD screen.
So has everyone got that on their own cameras? We all good? Nate? Donna? Everyone?
Yep.
Okay.
Does it display it sometimes in like a decimal?
I like what you mean. Sometimes it will just say 4,000. Because we already know it's 1 over something, so it might just say 4,000. You see that on there?
It says
Or like,
4.2.
okay.
But
That sounds like an aperture value.
Yeah.
Hmm.
yeah, just
Is there something next to that?
1.6, 1.3.
Okay. Yeah, so that's, if you point at the TV, it should give you a fraction. So it's giving you a value. If it says 3, it's 1/3 of a second.
Oh,
Will be
okay.
your shutter speed.
Okay.
Make sense? Since it was pointing at your leg and it's kind of dark right there,
Yeah. now
that
it
1.6
yeah.
means it was going to open for 1.6 seconds. So that's a long shutter speed. So everyone got it on their own cameras? So on the top, some people may have a screen on top. This is kind of a typical display. Can anyone identify the shutter speed in this display? This is trickier. James?
100?
Okay. Does that mean 100 seconds?
No, it's 1/100th of a second.
So since we already know it's a fraction of a second, they don't always need to put the 1 over. We just know it says it's 1 over something. Okay? So does everyone who has a screen on the top of their camera see where the shutter speed is? You see how the aperture value right next to it, f5.6, and on this one too, it's also right next to it. So on almost all cameras, the shutter speed and aperture value are going to be displayed right next to each other. Okay? So let's go on to aperture. So a large aperture, that is a small aperture value.
You said maybe stop.
Hmm?
Maybe stop reading.
Okay. A large aperture, that is a small f number, a wide open aperture, produces a very shallow depth of field, and that's illustrated on the left here. The depth of field is the range of distances from the camera at which the picture is sharp. So in this, using aperture f1.4, that's like a really wide open. The depth of field is very shallow. So you see the window in the back is totally out of focus, and everything in the front is out of focus, and the only thing that's in focus is the rabbit or whatever that thing is. And then a smaller aperture, that is a larger f number, you're still following that, how they work together, produces a wider depth of field. So an easy way to remember this, a small f number, small depth of field. Big f number, big depth of field. Okay? Make sense? So if you were going to take a picture of someone in front of a mountain, you would want to use an aperture like f16 to get them in focus and the mountain also in focus. Is that pretty clear? Most lenses have the sweet spot for sharpness, about f8 to f11, right in there. That's like their sharpest point. But don't feel compelled always to go there, because the difference between the sharp part and the not sharp part is you probably won't even ever notice it. It's for like techie nerds, you know, whine about. Okay. So, do you see why you might choose to change your aperture rather than your shutter speed for a given photograph? Or why you might prefer to change your shutter speed rather than the aperture? Or your ISO or whatever? Make sense? So here's an example of aperture. This is a larger f number, so a smaller aperture. My son put those rocks in his Elmo and said they were teeth, and so I wanted to take a picture of that. So I took the picture and I realized he's got a bunch of stuff back here like toys that are kind of distracting. So I used a wider aperture and got him out of there. See that? See there's some strategy there. So we already talked about aperture. Do you see the aperture value on your own cameras in the back screen? Is it right next to shutter speed? And on the top, if you have one, it should be right there. So ISO, the reason you would want to use a lower ISO is because it produces less digital noise than a higher ISO. And that's simulated, that's not really how it actually is, but it looks like that. And you see how using a higher ISO degrades the image. That's a better quality on the left than the one on the right. Does that make sense? So ISO, raising your ISO should be a last resort. If you can't find a combination of aperture and shutter speeds that will produce the picture you want, only then should you go to raise your ISO. Does that make sense? So I normally won't go above ISO 1600 unless it's like an emergency, because it produces a junk image. But sometimes the junk image is better than no image at all. You probably won't notice noise too much at ISO 100 or 200 or 400, once it starts getting to 800 and 1600, then you really start to notice it and it really starts to degrade the image. Many people will put their cameras on manual or a semi-manual mode. They'll let the camera choose the ISO and just keep it on auto. I don't really like that because sometimes it'll jump the ISO up to something really ridiculous for no reason. It'll go to ISO 1600 when ISO 400 would have worked better. So it'll give me a junk image. Yeah, makes sense here. It's another example. You can see how the image quality is degraded as you increase your ISOs. So on this one, you can almost make out what the words say. Actually, I can see some words there, drink and some other words. But as you increase the ISO, the image quality is degraded. So, and this, where is the ISO?
Right next to the ISO.
Right, where is this ISO? So it's ISO 100. Can everyone see the ISO value on their camera? What are some of the values? What do you have for ISO there?
100. I've done most of my shooting
Okay.
at them.
Well, yeah.
A.
Okay. Oh, we're gonna get there.
Yeah.
Cody, what do you have back there?
Well, I got it on. It was on 3200 because it's in some weird mode right now.
Okay. Fine. So we have a range here.
On the Nikon, it's gonna say it's not as clearly stated.
Yes, you may not have it. So on the top, if you have a top display, can anyone identify the ISO that this camera is using? Okay, this is a trick question. It's using auto ISO. So Paul, your A there means you have an auto ISO. So the way you can change that, you probably have a button on the back of your camera that says ISO. This camera, it's actually on that
On the
camera, it's on
camera,
top.
it's
Yep, some of them might be on top.
On the Nikons, depending on the model, it's on the back to the right of the screen. Just depends, but
Okay.
look down.
So I want everyone to change this right now to 400. So the way you do it is probably, does everyone know where the ISO button is? Can everyone see it on their camera?
What mode do you want us in?
Doesn't matter. Actually, put it on P for now. So if you're on auto mode, many cameras won't let you change the ISO to anything but auto. So we're getting away from auto. So press and hold normally. What you do is press and hold the ISO button and move one of the command dials that one of your right fingers is on. Got it to 400?
Yep.
Can you change it at will to whatever you want? Well, you got it figured out?
Not yet, but I will.
Okay. So do you have a dial in the front of the camera there? Where your right fingers? Nate, you got yours figured out?
I got it figured out, bud.
You got 400?
Yep,
You can control it as you wish to whatever ISO you want?
sure can.
Okay. Everyone in the back row?
Mine's pretty sick.
Freaking A students back there? Oh yeah, I'm not supposed to be sarcastic.
Not one that's this one. Hidden.
What's that? Okay, so you can go into a menu for it.
Okay.
If you hit menu there
Uh-huh.
and choose the one that has the camera, see there where it says ISO sensitivity or something like that?
Oh, okay.
So can you get it to go to 400?
Okay.
Okay, so we got that, and if you have a display on the top of your camera, it should say 400 where it says auto here. Alright, so the same exposure triangle is starting to make a little more sense, this diagram. We have our shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Changing the shutter speed affects the motion, the way motion is displayed in the photo. Changing the aperture affects the way the depth of field is in the photo. And you can kind of see that with f16, all four of the people are in focus. And at f2.8, only the one in front is. And then changing your ISO will increase or decrease the amount of noise in the image. So there will be some times when an increase in noise is acceptable to you, but motion in the photo is not acceptable, depending on the nature of the photo. So in that case, to make a proper exposure, you would maybe increase your ISO and then shorten down your shutter speed to something like 1/500th of a second. So is it clear how you can get different results by changing these parameters, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed? Okay. So this, by now you should be intimately familiar with this and can tell me if I shoot at 1/500th of a second and another photo at 1/15th, what differences should I expect to see between the two, assuming they're equivalent exposures? Motion.
The 115,
Okay.
let's motion it at 500.
So, are you gonna say something?
Well, I was just gonna say if it was a moving object, the 1/15th would be blurry,
Okay.
and the 500 would be more
Mm.
still.
And then, or if I was just shoot an aperture value of f2 and an f11, assuming equivalent exposures, what differences would I see in those pictures?
To just have the focus on the one item with blurry background.
Okay. And then ISO, difference between, say, ISO 3200 and 100.
Noise.
A lot of noise. Yeah. I was gonna say something else, I think. Oh, so using this, if you're shooting at the highest ISO at f2 and like, let's say 1/8 of a second, and then you change and move all the values to the top, you're changing the amount of light that your camera's collecting by like a factor of like 1,000 or maybe even more than that. So this photo here, I took it in the living room. And as you use these settings, you'll get to know, like I know in this house at night with all these lights on, I use f1.8, 1/50th of a second, ISO 800. That gives me a proper exposure. So the difference between this one and this one, I can calculate the different amount of light that's in the scene based on the different values I used. So if they're both properly exposed and they use the same values except for one's ISO 200 and the other's ISO 400, I can say that one has twice the amount of light in the scene as the other. Does that make sense? If they're both properly exposed, but they use same settings except for the ISO is different at one stop. Does everyone understand how that works? Getting some confusion here. Yeah? So the difference in the amount of light between this one and this one is actually 1,000 times. There's 1,000 times less light in this photo as in this photo. But using aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, we can accommodate this huge range of different brightnesses to make two equivalent exposures. They're both properly exposed. Make sense? Okay, so, I forgot one thing. So how do you control your exposure? Your camera has a built-in light meter that will tell you the proper exposure. So when you put it on auto and point it, it says, okay, this is the amount of light, so I need to use this aperture, this shutter speed, this ISO, and give it to you. If you want to control one of these parameters manually, then the camera will work around you and give you the other two to make a proper exposure. So, or if you want to choose two of the three values, then the camera will manipulate the third one on its own to give you proper exposure. Like we were doing with those pictures where we were giving them, how we could change it. Or if you want to choose all three of the values manually, your camera can tell you whether you're properly exposed or not. So, here's the shooting mode dial. Everyone has this on the top of their camera, yeah? If you don't, you're in the wrong class. And all the stuff at the bottom and the green auto, that's what you've probably been using, right? Most of the time, those. So we want to get away from that and hopefully not use that. Cross your fingers, maybe ever. But sometimes you might find that it is useful to use. But you should really, to take control of your camera, use one of the ones that's outlined in white on this dial. You may have a dial that looks more like that, where instead of a MASP, you have MAVTVP. So everyone recognize their dial among one of these two? Anyone have something radically different? No? Okay, so yeah, depending where you got your camera, right? So the different, we're going to use this one because it's a little simpler. The different modes, M stands for manual. If you're shooting in manual mode, let's go here, you will choose all three of these values, okay? And the camera can tell you whether you're overexposing or underexposing. I'm not going to tell you how that happens or how you can know, but if you really want to shoot manual mode, more power to you, and I will tell you personally later, some other time. If you want to shoot in AV, or in this one it's just A, that means aperture priority, where, assuming you've got your ISO on manual, like we all set to 400, you choose the aperture, and the camera will choose the shutter speed to match to make the proper exposure. So AV, or A, is for aperture priority. It's giving priority to the aperture. Yeah? Everyone make sense of that? Most people that are familiar with cameras, or enthusiasts or professionals, will either shoot in manual, or aperture priority. And I find, same as with me, depending on the circumstances, I will use manual or aperture. Like when I'm shooting in here at night, I know the settings that I need to use, and I don't want the camera messing around with them. Like, if you point your camera up into a light, it's going to take into account all that light coming in and adjust your exposure to try to fix it, to get it the right exposure. But if the light is not your subject, then it doesn't matter what the light looks like, it only matters what your subject looks like. So I don't want to accidentally have the camera underexpose something or overexpose it when I'm in here, if I know what values I'm supposed to use. And as you shoot in your house, you'll get to know kind of the proper value to use. Or if I'm outside or in changing conditions, I will use aperture priority. I'll set my ISO to what I want it, and then I'll change my aperture, and the camera can deal with the shutter speed. Oops. TV, if you have a Canon, or S, if you have a Nikon, stands for either shutter priority or time value. The AV is the aperture value. And in this mode, you, assuming your ISO is on manual, we've set it forward, you will directly choose your shutter speed, and your camera will choose your aperture. So let's try this. So let's go to A, not auto, aperture priority. And the way you choose your value, if everyone takes off their lens cap so the camera can get a reading on the light, you just point it up at the TV. Let's see if I can find the right picture. Let's go for that one. So you should have an aperture value and a shutter speed on there. You all good there? So you have a dial maybe where your thumb is or where your forefinger is. Whoop, who did that?
Should do our
And if you turn that dial, you'll see your aperture value changing. And if it's not changing, try turning it the other way. Does everyone see that? And you will notice as well that your shutter speed is changing along with the aperture speed.
Mine's not even showing the shutter speed. It's just a blank box.
Is it on
Do you-
aperture priority or is it on manual?
Looks like it's on aperture priority.
What is it?
Okay, let me see.
I have to click my button down a little bit.
Oh, there you go. Yep.
Okay.
Sometimes you have to press the shutter halfway down. I think that's written down.
To get it to meter.
Yeah. Maybe it's not written down. So, do you see how when you change your aperture value, your shutter speed changes as well? So using aperture priority, you can indirectly control your shutter speed by changing your aperture.
Yeah, it even gives me a cool graphic showing my.
You're actually using the EV right there.
Oh, what was it you saying?
His, on his camera when he's got it like up on TV, it's actually selecting the EV scale.
No, I'm pushing this button.
Oh, okay, yeah. You wanna have it on the.
So is everyone pretty comfortable with that? Everyone got that kind of figured out?
Yeah.
So what are the largest apertures you can get?
Why do
You
you
know,
show
so
me
turn
the
it all the way
Hit your half
to the
Oh,
smallest
there
F number you can get.
Now move your dial.
Till it won't go anymore.
4.0.
4.8?
Your dial.
Mine's only going
I
to
got
5.0, but I've not
it.
seen
Okay.
it lower
Just
before.
Okay.
that
Zoom
one.
out all the way to 18
Once you
millimeters.
go up.
Oh, got you.
That would probably give you a lower.
Roger
There
that.
we go.
Okay.
3.5.
We got there.
This one's 3.5.
Okay. What's the largest aperture you can get out of your cameras there in the back?
2.8.
Okay, Nate, what's your largest aperture you can get out of that?
Where?
Well, focused on TV.
Oh,
And then turn the dial until the number stops changing.
22.
Okay. Is that the largest aperture you can get?
No, that's a small.
Ah, good. There we go.
I'm a retard.
Erica, what do you got there?
4.
Okay, Cody.
3.5.
All right.
Yeah,
Nate.
3.5.
Okay, great. So do you see how we can change that? Shutter speed changes to match it. As you increase the size of the aperture, the shutter speed will go to a faster shutter speed. Yeah, everyone pretty clear on that one? So shutter priority is exactly opposite of that. You control the shutter speed and the camera controls the aperture. So put on shutter priority. This one, hardly anyone who is like what you might call an enthusiast or a professional uses shutter priority. It's extremely rare that someone would use it. I don't think I've ever used it. Maybe I've used it once. So let's put your cameras at the bright TV here, and you can give me some shutter speeds and change it, and watch as your aperture changes to match your shutter speed or to adjust for your shutter speed. Is everyone seeing that?
I like how mine says low.
Okay, that means there's not enough light for the camera to get to to meet your demands. So if we look at this, if 1/8 of a second f2 at that ISO doesn't, if that's as bright as your camera can go and it's still not enough, then it might say low. So something's got to change. Turn the light on, do something. Turn the flash on maybe. So everyone familiar with shutter speed or shutter priority or time value priority? It's just called shutter priority even if it says TV on yours. So don't use that one. It's not really useful. Because if you want to change the shutter speed, you can affect it indirectly using the aperture. Yeah, clear? Program mode is the P, and in this one, the camera gives you a suggested value, like auto. It shows you, if I was in charge, this is what I would do. You know, that if you put it on P and then put it on auto, it'll give you 2 identical settings. But then you can change the settings based on your preferences. So the camera gives you kind of suggested settings, and then you can change them. And everyone's cameras are a little different on how you change them, but you should be able to change either shutter speed or aperture value from program mode. But I don't want you doing that because it's cheating. Because the camera's making the decisions, and then you're making your decisions based off the cameras. But that's opposite of what we want. We want the camera to be the one that's taking the decisions from us. Okay, so is that pretty clear? So if you shoot an aperture priority, that's you can't go wrong with that. That's what most enthusiasts will either shoot aperture or manual. So just put on aperture and leave it there for now. Have you ever seen icons like this in your camera before? Somewhere in there? Do you have something like that on your camera?
They haunt my dreams.
Yeah, so you're looking like this.
They're on the screen.
Okay. Erica, you got something like that? So this is one I'm not going to be able to tell you how to do this on your own camera because they all vary a lot. But these 3 circles with the different things around them change the way your camera measures light to give you an exposure. And it's called metering modes. So if you go home and go in your manual, there'll be a section on metering modes, and it will tell you how to adjust these. Also, all these camera manuals can be downloaded for free online. They're all available. So this one here is the most common one. It's called matrix metering, or evaluative metering. And the icon suggests that the camera's looking at the whole scene, the whole frame, and taking a reading off all the stuff that's in the frame to produce a guess at what the proper exposure is. So in real life, this is kind of how we do it. We look at the scene, and there's some dark parts and some bright parts, but overall it's kind of, if you take the average, that's kind of how we see it. So if you're in a dark room and you go out into the bright light, your eyes actually close down their apertures to let less light in, and you'll still see some dark areas and some bright areas. Good night. And your camera's the same thing as well. So this is good for, good night, I love you. Those scenes where there's some dark areas and some light areas, but everything's kind of halfway between light and dark. Matrix metering is the way to go. Or if everything in the scene is equally important, like in this picture here. The next one, if you move it to the button to the top, I think this is, Erica, this is actually a picture of D7000, right? Is that what it looks like in yours?
Nope.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
That's called center weighted metering. And so, just based on what it looks like alone, what would you say the difference between matrix or evaluative metering and center weighted metering, the top icon, would be? Just based on the look of that alone.
You could be focusing on a particular part of your shot.
Okay. So in center weighted, see center weighted, yeah, good. It pays more attention to what's in the middle of the frame and kind of ignores what's around the edges. So this is a perfect example of when you would want to use center weighted metering. I didn't really care about the edges of the frame. It's just dark, I don't care what's over there. I don't really care if that's properly exposed or not. I don't even want the camera looking there. I only want it to look at the center part. And so this center part is kind of the size of the area you're going to get weighted metering. And then this one here at the bottom, what would the camera do in that, do you think, just based on that, the look of that icon alone?
Just solely one.
Okay.
device.
Yeah, so that's called spot metering. And the camera looks at a tiny section right in the middle of the frame and bases the exposure only on that, ignores everything else. So this picture here, since the sun was behind and the bright white deck of the ferry and the the sky and stuff was so bright, and since the sun was behind him, his face was completely in shadow. I knew that if I just used matrix medium or evaluative, it would take into consideration all that brightness in the back behind him, and then his face would be totally dark. So how many pictures do you have of someone in front of something important and their face is completely in shadow and dark? A lot? Everyone? Okay. So this can be avoided by using spot metering. So a meter on his face, and the camera only looks at what's at his face in the center of the frame. It gives me an exposure based only on that.
Was that spot? That
Spot
was
meter,
the
yep.
little dot, okay.
And that one, the difference between center weighted and spot metering, the spot metering one will just do a tiny, tiny spot right in the middle. And center weighted just more tends to look at what's in the middle and ignore more around the edges. It gives more weight to the center of the frame than it does to the edges of the frame. That makes sense? So we're going to go through some pictures. What metering mode do you think someone should use if they're taking this picture?
That looks like,
I'd
Okay.
say center.
Center.
You said matrix. You said it right?
Yeah, she said it, but I
Oh,
agree.
there we go. Okay. Anyone? Center? Spot? Who says, if matrix, I call you to defend your position?
Because you have
can
such
we
a great
go over
argument.
what's in, so matrix is the,
Mm-hmm.
is it
think
called
average.
evaluative? Like-
Evaluative, yeah, matrix
Okay.
evaluative or average, meaning it depends still on the silly nature.
And then
That's
mine has
basically-
one called partial metering. Is that?
Is that center weighted? Probably?
But then I have another one that's center weighted average. F4.
Well,
Oh,
oh,
I don't know. I don't know what
I'm
partial
trying to figure out
metering
which
is.
one you're talking
Okay.
about. Okay.
You have spot metering on there?
Yeah.
So partial,
Evaluative.
Canon, oh shoot, I know this. I don't know what it is.
It's like everything but the middle dot is what it is. It's just the out.
Okay.
oh, yeah,
It
I
says
think I have one of those too.
obtained, oh, no, it gives a little description.
I'll just. I
Okay.
got it. It's okay.
So this one, are there areas of the picture that are not properly exposed? That are either under or overexposed?
Yes.
center is overexposed.
So everything, all the stuff in the back is overexposed. So do you think the camera took that into consideration when it was taking the picture? Probably not, yeah? Because if it did, it wouldn't be overexposed. If the camera was looking at back there, it would have said, I need to expose this properly. So this is probably center weighted or maybe spot metering. You see right here, this area is perfectly exposed, that's the proper exposure. So a spot metering right there would give you correct exposure, or maybe center weighted, I don't remember. Is that pretty clear? But this one, what is this a good candidate for? Okay, matrix or evaluative. There's dark areas, there's light areas, but it's all kind of in the middle and it's all equally important. This one, any guesses?
Spotter or center.
Okay, yeah, more or less. Now we're getting to the practical part. So if your kid's in the snow, you're taking a picture of the snow and it's like dark. It's the middle of the day, you take a picture and the picture comes out kind of dark.
Spot.
Seen that before? So spot meter. This one?
Center.
Say matrix.
Okay, I think. Yeah, one of those two probably.
Because you're detailed in black.
There's detail in even the darkest areas. If you did spot metering, it would meter on the hair, right? So that would probably be a little brighter. So I don't think spot metering. So center weighted maybe, or matrix or evaluative. One of those. There's no real right answer all the time for this kind of stuff. So what do you think of this one? Any guesses? Okay. Can anyone say why they said that?
Do you see lights and darks?
Okay.
Shadows and
Yeah, there's bright parts and dark parts, but it's all kind of in the middle and all kind of equally important.
There's a high dynamic range.
Yes, that's right. Here's a good one. That's a tricky one here.
Ooh.
Any guesses? Anyone? If you were taking this picture, what would you use?
I would use matrix.
Okay. Think that's a good idea? Anyone? I think it's fine. I took this picture 4 years ago, and just yesterday when I was looking at these pictures and kind of going through them again, I noticed there's a bird up there in the corner. See that?
Oh, cloud.
4 years hidden. Okay, this one. This one has a right answer. So this one I use center weighted. I know this one I did use center weighted metering. If I use spot metering, where it would meter probably right in the middle of his nose or right between his eyes, and see how that's kind of a brighter part in the image. If I did spot mirroring, that would probably be a little darker. I didn't really care what's on the edges, around the edges of the frame, because it's just this background I don't care about. So I did center weighting to get more, to weight the center more than the edges. But I didn't want to do spot. See how I came to that decision. So this one,
Spot,
why?
because it's focused on his face and his body.
And
The
his
expo-
face isn't as dark as it would be.
Right, his face is in a shadow, you can see there. So if it was maybe value to a matrix mirror, its face would be really dark. And you can see that the camera picked kind of a weird exposure because the back, it's really bright back there. So we know it's probably not evaluated for matrix metering, or else that would have been brought down a little bit more. Okay, this one?
That's just awesome.
Clearly.
Yes. Yeah, that's the right answer. So I'll go for it. No. What do you think?
That's just-
Nature.
Sure, matrix or center weighted probably. So there isn't, I don't know what I did. Probably matrix, I don't know. There's a right answer. In every situation there isn't like one you have to choose. And if you choose the other one you're wrong. But you should think about whether you're using the right metering mode or not in a given situation. So, does that make sense to everyone? Everyone clear on that? So that is kind of really important. Metering modes. Go home, look in your manual, figure out how to operate your metering modes. This picture, there's something wrong with it besides the flash. His eyes are kind of bluish, and his shirt is kind of bluish, and the wall is bluish. But that wall is one of these walls, and these walls aren't blue. The problem is, this photo has what's called the wrong white balance. To our eyes, a lot of light looks white. That may not actually be white. It may have a yellow or blue tint or a different color. Like for instance, if you go outside at night, the streetlights look orange at first, and if you're out there for a long time, then the orange just kind of goes away and they look white again. Has that ever had that experience before? And our brains adjust for the different colors of light to kind of move us always to back to making the light look white. So in this picture, the camera didn't know what color the light was coming in, and it guessed and made the wrong guess because the whites of his eyes are blue. So that's wrong. That's the wrong white balance. This is another wrong white balance, but here is pretty close to the right white balance. So have you ever had the experience of taking a picture maybe in shadow and everything's kind of bluish, or in daylight and it comes out kind of blue or purplish, or taking a picture indoors or at night and it's really, really yellow or orange, like sickly and just horrible, can't even use it. So if you adjust your white balance, your camera can adjust for all those different situations. So this one, I want to do some white balance practice here. So you probably have a button that says white balance on the back, maybe WB, or a button that says menu, and then you can go to change white balance from there, or something like that. Everyone got that? It might be on the top as well.
If
you
you
can.
push your Q button,
Uh-huh.
then you can just click the white balance.
Or, where,
It's an up button.
which
Do you have
icon
a
was
button?
it? Or which?
She seems me.
Okay, I
You
got
push
that
the
one.
Q, and it comes up white balance right there.
Similar.
Didn't see WB on one.
Cody, Don.
Is it just the up? Do like an up? Do a similar camera?
It's the T4i. I have
Oh.
the same as her.
Okay.
Is it AWB?
Yeah.
Okay. Why didn't I see that?
So AWB, what is that setting?
Auto white balance?
Yeah, there you go. See, now we're getting it. So you probably, as you scroll through, you probably have to scroll or press an arrow key, and you will get different icons, like an icon that looks like a light bulb,
Okay.
or one that looks like a lightning bolt, that's for flash, or one that looks like a cloud.
Or one that looks like
Under-
a flat centipede.
Yeah, the one that looks like a flat centipede. Yes. So under what conditions would you use the white balance with the icon of a cloud?
And cloudy
It's
day.
kind of on the outside.
Or,
Overcast.
yeah, overcast. What if there's an icon, you have one with the house with like
A
Shade.
a shadow, so shade, or sun, you use that on a sunny day. So this is a really quick and easy way of making a better photo. Here's another example. This is in the kitchen. That towel behind him, it looks kind of yellowish there, doesn't it? And there. Now it's blue. It's actually a white towel. So that's the wrong white balance. And that is the product of auto white balance right there. So the camera just took a guess, because it doesn't know, it doesn't, if it sees yellow, it doesn't know if it's supposed to be white or yellow or what, so it's just kind of guessing. It doesn't always guess right, like this is often the case. There, bad. There's a pretty close to good enough white balance. That kind of pretty closely represents the colors. Does that make sense? Okay, we understand white balance well. So white balance is another one. If you're taking pictures, unlike your shutter speed or your aperture, you might change those every single picture you take. Use a different shutter speed or a different aperture. White balance, you just kind of set it. I'm outside and it's sunny. It's just sunny. Just leave it for a couple hours. You go inside, change it for takes 2 seconds to change it to inside or whatever. So you don't have to worry so much about that. Or you can just use auto if you want. The camera does a decent job. So this picture is pretty good. Do you think I used a fast or slow shutter speed here?
Yeah, so
Okay,
Okay, yeah, it's good. But it's kind of dark, isn't it? So what metering mode do you think I used in this one? Just anyone? Matrix? Any other
No.
guesses? I think it's probably Matrix. I don't remember though. But it's kind of dark, and the reason that is because everything is actually really bright. Clouds, if you look at them, are kind of bright, and the jet was really bright colored, but the camera doesn't know what it's looking at. So in Matrix or evaluative metering mode, it just takes the darkest and the brightest parts and like kind of averages and shoots right for the middle. So if everything's really bright, it doesn't know it's supposed to be bright. It just says, oh, that's the average right there. Everything's this one brightness, that must be the average brightness. So it brings it down. So that's a better exposure. In this one, some of the shadow areas, like underneath the vertical stabilizers, you can't see anything. And on the bottom half of the body of the jet, it's kind of too dark to see anything. But this one, you see all the decals and stuff, and it more accurately represents, that's what the sky looks like. It's bright. That's kind of more closely represents the sky, cloudy day. So I knew, again, this is simulated. This is actually the same photo. I just changed it kind of in the computer. But I knew that this, as the jet was going to go by, that the camera was going to get it wrong because it's a bright cloud right behind it. And the jet was really bright, so I knew that the camera was going to give me the wrong exposure. So the way I can correct that, being smarter than the camera, we have something called exposure compensation, which gave me this exposure line, did it. And using exposure compensation, you can tell the camera, whatever reading you give or you get, I want you to give me an exposure that's half a stop greater or maybe 1 stop greater than that. So whatever you think you're supposed to do, give me an extra stop in my photos. So you compensate for the exposure. Does that make sense? So this one I think is maybe 2/3 of a stop or something like that. And that's a better exposure, I think. This one you can't see in the cockpit, and that one you can't see in the cockpit. So this one, this is what I was talking about earlier. So that doesn't look too bad actually on the screen. So imagine this is dark. You have these pictures of snow in the middle of the day, but it's like dusky and dark. It's because there's so much brightness, bright snow. The camera thinks, oh, that must be the average. I need to expose that at a median color. So I knew that there was gonna be dark, or it was gonna do that. And his face is dark. You see there? So I increased the exposure by using exposure compensation. So I tell the camera, whatever you think you're gonna do, give me an extra stop, or give me an extra half a stop of exposure. So this is another spot where you would use exposure compensation. The sun was behind this person, and if I just took the picture on auto, his face would be all dark and black, you know? But I knew in advance that was going to be the case, so I told the camera, expose an extra stop to what you think you're supposed to do. So it took the sun into consideration. Even if it was on center weighted, the sun was like right behind his head, so it's just so bright that it would kind of overwhelm the camera. So whatever you think you're going to do, cut down, give me 1 stop or 1.5 stops less than that, or greater than, or whatever the condition is, you can tell your camera. So this one would have been maybe 1 or 2 stops extra, increase exposure by 1 or 2 stops. And it gives me the right exposure on the parts of the picture I care about. I don't really care about this guy back there because it's not important. He's important. So you have a button like this. Okay, everyone had the button? So if you press and hold that button and scroll your command dial on the front, you'll see it go to minus and then maybe 0.5, 1, or 0.3, 0.7, 1, something like that. Do you see that? Paul?
Yeah, it's going. So It goes down to like, it has an inch symbol behind it when I go to the left.
Okay.
So like 1 inch. I'm
So-
sure it probably doesn't mean inches on it.
What do you think it means?
That's probably a negative
How many stops?
1.3.
So if it says 1 inch, probably 1 stop negative.
Oh,
or
yeah,
when it has a
I'm
little-
sorry, I was on, yeah.
So if it goes to, or 1.3.
1 second.
Yeah, 1.2
Oh,
seconds.
It's
Look-
shutter speed.
okay. I got the wrong here.
Yeah, that's just the 2 hash marks is the symbol for seconds.
So that'll be there. Okay, I see here. So underneath where it shows the shutter speed, if you press and hold it, you see that little line with the different bars.
Mm-hmm.
So yours goes in third stop increments. So you have a 0, and then 2 little dots, and then kind of a larger dot. And if you scroll the wheel, you'll see the line moving back and
Yeah.
forth. So one stop would be, you've got your center line,
Mm-hmm.
and then 2 little dots and a bigger dot. That bigger dot's 1 stop. So you can go by third stop increments on there.
Okay.
So if you tell the camera go minus 0.7 stops, are you going to get a darker or a brighter picture than you otherwise would have got?
Darker.
Okay, you're going to underexpose and minus your happy. Does that make sense? Situations where you would consider using this. I use this actually almost every picture I take because of a certain situation on my camera. So situations to create a nice skin glow on people, you increase the exposure by 0.3, makes it nice, gives a nice bright skin tone. If there's a bright light behind the subject, you might increase it by 0.7 exposure values. If there's snow, you increase it by a whole stop. Does that make sense? To increase the brightness, otherwise you get a dark picture. Or if the subject is the brightest thing in the photo, like there's that one picture a few back where he was standing when he was a little baby and the sun right on him and everything else was dark. So if I would have just let the camera choose the exposure on that one, he would have been completely washed out and so bright and everything else would have been better exposed. So you can decrease your exposure value if the subject is the brightest thing in the photo. Does that make sense why you want to do that? Or if your camera tends to over or underexpose photos, I feel like my camera tends to overexpose photos just a tiny little bit. So I do like exposure, I change my exposure value to like minus 0.3 stops or something like that, third of a stop under, to prevent that from happening. And you use this button. So we're back here again. Does everyone understand exposure compensation? So that's a really easy way to take control out of your camera's hands and into your hands. James, you look like you want to say something. Oh, I forgot to use the picture I was going to say earlier.
I was going to say the black-white example is a really good way of showing what your camera's trying to do. You can take a picture of something that's solid black. Like if I took a picture of his jacket, the picture on the camera, if it was automatically choosing the exposure to make it right, it would be gray. And if I took a picture of the back of this piece of paper and I looked at that photo, it would be gray. Because the camera's trying to make all of the color input that it has or light input that it has centered in one range. So,
Does that make sense to everyone? So your camera doesn't know.
camera's lying to you.
Yeah, it doesn't know what it's talking about.
Exactly.
It doesn't know what is in the frame. It doesn't know what the subject is. It doesn't know what it's looking at. So it doesn't know if, it gives you exposure that's kind of right most of the time, but there's a lot of situations where it's not going to be right. Like we talked about earlier with the airplane or whatever. So these buttons here, AE, L, and AFL, you may have something like that, or maybe not. This is another one you're going to have to go into your manual. So AEL stands for auto, actually, let's do AF lock first. AFL, autofocus lock. Canons have a different system for this, so don't even bother looking for AFL. Unless you have
Is
it,
it
in
the
which
same
case,
thing as AF?
AEL or AFL, you have that?
There's AF, one shot, AI focus, and AI servo. Is that something different? Or is that
That's autofocus, that's a different thing.
Okay.
So AFL is autofocus lock. Most cameras have this ability, but you really do have to look in your own manual. So what this does, if you ever tried to focus on like a moving subject, the focus kind of tracks back and forth, trying to chase it, Like if someone's running away from you and you're trying to focus on it, the focus tracks back and forth as you hold the shutter halfway down or
I
whatever.
think on these you can actually tap the screen and it locks on it.
So AFL will do that. It will lock the focus in one spot. So in this camera, what you do is you focus where you want it, then press that button, and it will lock the focus there. I use this when I'm chasing my son around the house. I know he's going to be in a certain spot coming by, and if I try to track him with the autofocus, it's not going to get him. It's going to be off. You know, it's going to miss him, and every photo's going to be blurry as he goes by. But if I know that he's going to be, you know, in this certain spot, I can see him running towards me. I focus right there, and I lock the focus there. And as he's approaching there, I start taking pictures. And as he passes that spot, right when he's there, I take a picture, and that's going to be in focus. So the focus doesn't track him; it's locked. Does that make sense? So it's useful for catching a subject moving toward or away from the camera. And it's also useful if you want to focus on a still object. You can put it in the middle of the frame, get a focus, press AF lock, and then move the camera to get it to one side of the frame or the other. Is that be clear how you would do that?
On some you have to hold the lock button.
Yes. On a lot of you hold it. So auto exposure lock is the other one, AEL, and it's similar except for it locks the exposure. So on that picture of the airplane, as it was going by, it was out in the air, so they're like real low, you know. It would pass through there'd be clouds behind it, and as I would turn to follow it, it would go in front of trees, and the trees were a lot darker than the clouds. So if I let the camera give me exposure based on what it thought as it was going by, it would give me one exposure for when it had the clouds behind it because they're so bright. And then when it got really dark all of a sudden, it would change the exposure. And then the airplane would be it wouldn't be properly exposed. Does that make sense? But all I really cared about was the airplane. That's all I really wanted to be properly exposed. I didn't care what was behind it. So I got the right exposure on the airplane, then held AEL, or auto exposure lock, and that kept that same exposure no matter where I pointed the camera. It always gave me the same exposure. It's similar to like putting the camera in manual for exposure. Just keeps the same exposure. Does everyone understand that? In this one, you probably have to go into your camera's manual, not manual mode, but the actual paper thing to learn how to use it. I use auto exposure lock a lot. I rarely use autofocus lock, except for in the case I mentioned, where he's running towards me in the house and I lock it and I wait for him to get to that spot. So another example, or another use of auto exposure lock, if you put your camera in spot metering mode and your subject, you put it in the center of the frame, get a exposure, the camera doesn't know if the subject it's supposed to be metering is like on the side of the frame or in the corner. So it just, whatever's in the middle is what it exposes on. So you turn your auto exposure lock, or you get to your auto exposure lock, get an exposure, put the subject right in the middle of the frame, hold the button, and then you can move it out to the corner of the frame or wherever else you were going to put it, but keep the same exposure if you're in spot metering mode. Does that make sense? See how that could be useful? Okay, how to read a lens. Oh, I forgot, we're supposed to talk about focus points. I don't want to talk about those. Don't even get me started. So, how to read a lens. All lenses are marked with their focal lengths and their maximum aperture value. So, what is the focal length on this lens? In millimeters.
15.
50 millimeters. Is this a zoom lens?
No.
No, it does not. It does not zoom. Trick question here, what's the maximum aperture value?
1.4.
You'd say?
1.4.
Yeah, f1.4. So on lenses, it won't have an f and then a slash. It will say 1 to 1.4. But that's f1.4. Make sense? So what's the zoom range and maximum aperture of this lens?
2.8.
f2.8 is aperture. What's the focal length?
147.
So it's a zoom lens, yeah. So that makes sense, 2470, so that means it zooms. So this one, what's the focal length? Okay. What's the maximum aperture value on this lens? Trick question.
At 18 it would be 3.5, but at 55 it would be 5.6.
Okay, it's a variable aperture lens, which means as you zoom, which you saw earlier, that when you zoom towards the longer end, the maximum aperture you get closes down. And that's because aperture is a function of the focal length and the diameter. So if you have the same diameter but a longer focal length, it's going to be actually a smaller aperture. So I want to critique some photos now.
Ooh.
I pulled this one off Facebook. Tell me how we could, without demeaning the person who took it, because I don't know if it's taken with a camera that has any kind of manual controls, or if he, I don't know the situation that he was in when he took the photo. So let's be constructive. How, if we were taking this, what, and
I'm
had,
pretty sure that was the concert I was at.
had all the resources
Had
we
my
need,
baby pants.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
whatever, that guy.
Yep.
You have any pictures like that?
I don't know, I wasn't really.
So how could we improve this photo?
Posting.
What are some of the problems? I said this is not
There's a lot of
suggestion.
noise.
Okay, a lot of noise. You can see it a lot in the dark areas on that side, and here in the curtain. You see all that noise. What are some of the other problems here? And how could we? Oh wait, how could we fix that? Improve that? Just imagine we had like a miraculous camera that could do miracles. How could we improve this
Lower the
situation?
ISO.
Okay, yeah, lower ISO.
But then you gotta adjust the other settings too.
Right. James,
Spot metering.
what would that fix?
The overexposure of the individual that you actually wanted to take a picture
Yeah.
of as opposed to
So the
people
only
that-
important thing in this picture, you can't see. It's just white. So if they printed this picture, the printer would put ink down, and it would just lift the head up and go across. And so it literally wouldn't print. Yeah. It's overexposed, the subject's overexposed, spot mirroring. What would be another way to get a proper exposure if, let's say you took this picture and looked at it and said, whoops, and tried to make an adjustment, how else could you get a better exposure? Besides spot mirroring. Suggestions?
Mess with your aperture and all that.
So you could put on manual and then manually decrease the exposure value. Or you could use exposure compensation and like maybe go -2 stops or something like that. Okay. Good. So this photo, what's the problem here?
Underexposed.
Way, way underexposed. So how would you remedy that problem?
Well, you don't mind a little movement in the photo, you can slow down the shutter speed.
Or any other suggestions? Just more than one right answer. And
Lower the aperture.
or aperture or ISO. So so if you had this, if you took a picture, looked at it, and it was like this, you could figure out a way to fix it. What's the problem here?
The white balance.
Besides the obvious problems,
White.
the white balance is way off.
It's perfect for the camera though.
Yeah, definitely the candle does look great. So how would you fix this one?
Change the white balance.
Color
Change the white
temperatures.
balance.
Yeah, to whatever, whatever balance. This one here? What's the problem?
Camera blur.
Low shutter, or
Yeah, slow
low,
shutter speed.
slow shutter speed.
Yeah, you see these right here in the bottom, these are supposed to be just points of light, but they're lines of light because the person on the camera, which is me, moved when the shutter was open. So it's too blurry, just too slow of a shutter speed. And I think that's it. Get everything I think we did. Questions about any of the stuff we talked about? Next week we're going to talk more about applying this stuff to get a better photo. So we're going to look at a lot more pictures. Any questions about what we're talking about here? Anyone? Was this beneficial?
Yeah.
Okay. So next week, I'll go come same time. You don't have to come if you thought this sucked, but if you didn't, then please do. Even if you did think it sucked, please come anyways and just don't say anything. I don't